Good morning, everybody. We're going to give you a few minutes to get everybody in. See, we've got a few participants joining us. Okay, it's just 11 o'clock, 10 o'clock in the UK, 11 o'clock here in Brussels. So hopefully a few more people will join us in the next couple of minutes. We'll give everyone a minute or two to join us and get organized. And in the meantime, perhaps those of you who are here with us already could just write a message to us in the chat and let us know where you're joining us from today, a bit about you, what your mother tongue is, how many languages you speak, that kind of thing, so we know who our audience is and where our audience is. You can use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to do that. No one's going to be brave and write the first message. Yes, Lisa from London, originally from Sweden. Hey, Lisa. Okay. So quite a few from the UK, but also joining from elsewhere as well. That's great. So I'm Claire, I'm in Brussels. As you can tell, my mother tongue is English, and I also work from French, Italian, and Spanish. And perhaps I could ask our other panelists for this morning to just very briefly introduce themselves, where they're joining from, what their languages are. Maybe we'll start with Owen.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Owen. I'm an interpreter at the European Commission. I'm joining you from Brussels, like Claire. And I work from French and Spanish into English, and I'm working on German. And I'm joining you from home, so apologies if my cat jumps up on me at some stage, but that'll add a little bit of spontaneity to proceedings.
Okay. Lorraine, would you like to give us a brief intro to who you are?
Sure. Good morning. I'm Lorraine, and I work at the European Parliament in the English booth. My languages are French, German, Spanish, and Dutch, and I work from those four languages into my mother tongue, English, and I'm based in Brussels.
And no cats in your house today?
No cats. I'm dialing in from the office today.
Okay, and Phoebe?
Good morning, everyone. I'm an interpreter at the Court of Justice of the European Union, working in the English booth from French, Italian, and Portuguese, and I'm working on Spanish, and I'm joining you today from Luxembourg.
Okay, so that was a brief introduction to us. We can see some of your names and where you're joining from, but we'd just like to get a bit of a better idea of how much you know about language learning and what exactly your interests are, what you know about interpreting, if anything. So I'm going to launch a poll, and if you could just select one of the options to tell us a bit about who you are and which of the options best describes you. I'll keep it open for half a minute or so. Okay, so a bit of everything then, quite a mixed audience today. So quite a few of you seem to be interested in languages or studying interpreting. Some of you are none of the above, but presumably some kind of interest in languages nonetheless. Okay, so a very varied audience, I would say. Most of you have answered, I think, 85%. Okay, thank you for that. And one other question, just by way of introduction, and to let us give us a bit of an idea how much you know about the European Union. Without using Google, I'd like to see how many people know how many languages are spoken in the European Union. How many working languages are used in the European institutions? So some people have selected all of the answers. There's a few people not answered yet. Okay, the winner seems to be 24, which is correct. Well done to the 16 of you who got that right. 3 languages, I can see why you might have put that. We have 3 kind of operational languages. We often on a day-to-day level work in French, English, and German. 6 languages is the UN. Some of you may have got mixed up with that. And 27 is how many member states there are. So I can understand why some of you chose those options, but 24 is indeed the correct answer. So that was by way of introduction. What we're going to do now is hear a little bit from our panelists in more detail, what they do and how they became interpreters. I would just say, we want this to be your session and we want to answer questions that you find useful. So please use the question and answer function on your screens to ask any questions that you have of our panelists or of any of us. You can write things in the chat if you want to, but it's much easier if you use the question and answer function. So at any point, feel free to write a question to us and we'll try and get through them, as many of them as we can before the end of the session. So I'd like to start by hearing from our panelists, and we'll start with Phoebe. Phoebe, can you tell us a bit about your background, your path towards becoming an interpreter, and how you got to where you are today, please?
So hello again, everybody. So yes, I'm Phoebe. As I said, I work at the European Court of Justice and have done as a staff interpreter since 2018. Before that, I worked as a freelance interpreter for all of the institutions. As I said, my language combination is French, Italian, Portuguese into English, and I'm working on Spanish. So I grew up in London in a purely English-speaking household. I didn't have another language that I spoke at home or anything. And I studied French and Italian at school and liked it so much that I went on to do that at university. So I did a 4-year bachelor's course in French and Italian at the University of Bristol. Of course, with the year abroad that comes with that. So I studied in France, I worked in Italy, and I really wanted to keep my languages alive. So in my final year, I went to a careers talk where somebody from the University of Bath was speaking about the course in interpreting and translation. And I suddenly thought, yes, this is for me. I want to work with pure language. So I went straight from Bristol down the road to Bath and did a master's in interpreting and translation. It was a 1-year course, so very intense, quite speedy, but absolutely brilliant. And after graduating from Bath, I moved to Italy. Italy is the country that I had grown to love over the years, especially learning French and Italian. And I found a job working in a law firm in Milan. So I started specializing in legal translation, more specifically company law. I spent only 1 year at the law firm because 6 months later, I passed the European institutions accreditation test to work as a freelance interpreter for them. And so that was in 2013. And then I spent the next 5 years working as a freelance interpreter for all of the institutions that are represented here today. And during that time, I also did the traineeship for interpreters that the Court of Justice offers as well. And I can say more about that if anybody's interested later on. I lived in Brussels, Italy. I moved around a lot. And while I was freelancing, I started learning Portuguese to add it as my 3rd language. So I spent my summers doing courses in Lisbon to improve that. And then in 2018, I started working full-time at the Court of Justice. I sat a competition and became staff soon after joining, and added Portuguese to my combination in 2019, a year later. And then I started learning Spanish 1 year after that. And I'm aiming to be able to add that to my combination as well in the next couple of years. I think I'll stop there. That's a bit about me.
Okay, thank you very much. That was very interesting, and I'm sure there are going to be a few follow-up questions on some of the points you raised. But first of all, we'll hear from Lorraine. Can you tell us a bit about your background?
Sure. Hello again. Now, I mentioned in my introduction that my 4 working languages are French, German, Spanish, and Dutch. And I'd just like to point out at this stage that I learnt most of those languages as an adult. You do not have to grow up in a monolingual or excuse me, bilingual or multilingual environment to become an interpreter. Like Phoebe, I grew up in an English-speaking family, first in Birmingham and then in the west of Ireland. My first contact with a language other than English came aged 8 when I started learning Irish in primary school. I began learning French at secondary school level, but as I said, most of my languages came as an adult. I began learning German at university during my undergraduate course, and Spanish and Dutch much later on whilst I was working in Brussels as an interpreter. So don't be daunted by the idea of having 3 or 4 working languages as an interpreter. It is entirely feasible. Most of us start our careers with just 2, and most of us come from a monolingual background. In any case, the other point that I wanted to make was that there are many different pathways and timelines into interpreting. Phoebe very impressively trained as an interpreter straight out of an undergraduate course. My pathway and timeline was a little different. I just explored other careers before turning to interpreting in my late 20s. I started with a BA in Applied Languages at Dublin City University. That was French and German from scratch at that stage. The focus in the 4-year course was on specialized translation. So we did look at other subjects such as economics and science, for example. I spent my summers working in France and Germany. I was fortunate enough to complete an exchange year in Leipzig. That was brilliant. And I have to say that when I graduated, I didn't really have a long-term career plan at that stage. I knew I enjoyed translation work and that I wanted to spend more time living abroad. And that's what I did for the next 7 years. I moved around, lived in Switzerland, Germany and France. I held various jobs. I worked as an English language teacher. I had a short contract as a précis writer, and I sought to hone my skills as a translator, freelance work. I secured a staff position as a translator, and it was at that stage that I came back into contact with interpreting and decided in my late 20s that it might be a good career option for me. I completed a 1-year course in conference interpreting at the University of Westminster, and at that stage, then after graduation, took the accreditation test for the European institutions. I'd just like to say that the 7 years that I spent between my undergraduate and master's degrees were probably pretty essential for me because I needed the time to consolidate my languages, but above all, I needed the life experience and general knowledge that I acquired in that period. Like Phoebe, after a few years working as a freelance interpreter, I joined the staff, in my case at the European Parliament, and since working as a conference interpreter, I've learned and added Spanish and Dutch to my combination. And I think I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lorraine. That was very interesting. And finally, Owen, can you briefly tell us how you got to where you are today?
Great, thank you very much, and good morning to everyone again. Yeah, kind of a similar route into interpreting to Lorraine, I would say, a slightly circuitous route. Lorraine took 7 years. I think I took about 11 years to get into interpreting. It was always something that intrigued me. Every so often, you might notice it still happens every now and again on the BBC or on The Guardian. There's an article about how the big international organizations are crying out for English mother tongue interpreters. So I saw these articles and I sort of thought, oh, maybe I could do it. And but I think I needed that time as well, like Lorraine. I needed to be roughed up by life a little bit and get this sort of life experience and also consolidate my languages. One thing that I'll say, which is very important, is you need to be able to take feedback. And I think I was a bit touchy, a bit sensitive, maybe when I was in my 20s. I would have taken it very personally. Whereas by the time I got into my 30s, I was, I think, 31 when I started my master's. I had that sort of perspective where I thought, the person isn't criticizing me. They're just saying, you know, that performance could have been better. Try this, try that. So I think I just had a bit more maturity and a bit more life experience. And that really helped me when I was training as an interpreter, to take the feedback on board, to take it seriously, but not take it personally, as Hillary Clinton once said. My route into interpreting, yes, I grew up in a monolingual family as well. There are people who, you know, are children of diplomats and go to international schools. Those people are out there in interpreting. I think at the beginning of the profession, it was pretty much just those people. But now you meet more and more people who are, you know, from monolingual backgrounds. I grew up in Northern Ireland, very ordinary background. We only spoke English at home. I learned some Irish at school, but it wasn't terribly well taught and I wasn't particularly into it. But once I started learning French, that's when my passion for languages really came along. I only did French up to A level, and I did French at university, European business and French. So it was sort of focused on economics and business and marketing and all sorts of other things, which is very useful now in interpreting. I also started studying Spanish when I was at university, but as an additional module. And then I wanted to really consolidate my languages. I did the year abroad. And then afterwards, I said, I don't want to be a language graduate in name only. I want to actually be able to speak my languages. So you sometimes meet language graduates in the UK who go, oh, yeah, I did French and German at university, but I can't actually speak them. And it's like, well, what's the point? What were you doing for all those years? So I wanted to make sure that, you know, if someone asked me, what did you do at university? I could say, I did this and I can actually speak these languages and I actually understand something about these countries. So I lived in Bordeaux in France for 3 years. I worked at the university there teaching English. Then I moved to Madrid. I wanted to really give my Spanish a good boost. So I lived in Madrid for 3 years. And then that was around the time of the financial crisis, kind of the early 2010s. And I got a bit fed up of not being paid very much and not really seeing my career moving forward. So I moved to the UK, to the northwest of England, where I worked for a university language centre, which was a good job. I enjoyed it a lot, but I was made redundant, sadly. And I thought, right, well, what can I do? I'd had 2 or 3 years of experience in that job. And I thought, right, I've always wanted to do interpreting. I've got the time, I've got the money. Let's just go for it and see. And I would really say that doing interpreting training is very, very useful anyway. Even if you don't go into interpreting, there's so many transferable skills that you get from interpreter training. Public speaking skills, research skills, knowing about the world around you. It's an incredibly good master's from that point of view. We see it every day. We interpret from people who can't speak in public, who are terrible public speakers, who are very bad at explaining jargon. So having those skills will make you very employable, not just in interpreting, but in all sorts of other areas as well. I did the course in Manchester, which sadly doesn't exist anymore. It was a very good course, but it's now defunct. I did it part-time over 2 years. So I was able to keep working to fund my studies. And it meant I had a full year of doing consecutive interpreting. Often people do a very short stint of consecutive interpreting and then turn all their attention to simultaneous. But doing a lot of consecutive means that my consecutive is still pretty good because I did so much of it. I graduated in 2017. Then I did the accreditation test in 2018. Worked as a freelancer for a little while, but was fortunate enough to get a temporary contract at the European Commission starting in September 2019. So I'm still on that temporary contract. And the difference between myself and the other esteemed panelists is that I'm still a temp. So I have to do what's called a competition to become an official. And I think I'll leave it there. I work from French and Spanish, as I was saying, and I'm working on German. Working on German basically means attending classes, spending as much time there as possible, watching the news, keeping up with what's happening in Germany and Austria. As Lorraine rightly said, we all started with 2 languages, or most people start with 2 languages and then add to their combination. And it might seem daunting, but it's just, you just have to keep plugging away at it, little and often, I think is the best approach when adding a language. And I'll leave it there for now.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think we've partially addressed Louisa's question. Louisa says she's 42 now, but has always dreamt of working for the EU. Is she getting too old, or is there still a chance? I think we've touched on that. People have come from all different backgrounds, and we have people who do qualify when they're older. And I know certainly on my interpreting course when I did it, that there were people who'd taken some time out after graduating and had other careers. I don't know if any of our panelists would like to briefly add anything to help answer Louisa's question. Owen, for example, you are.
Yeah, I mean, I was a little bit younger than that, but I think I was 34 when I passed the accreditation test. I think it's a huge asset to be a little bit older and have all that general knowledge, that life experience. You know, even something silly like, you know, having a mortgage or having, you know, to insure your car. These are the sorts of things that come up in meetings. You know, at the European Commission, we tend to do quite technical meetings where people are talking about home insurance or you know, different types of insurance policies across Europe, or pensions or things like that. I mean, if you're 22, I didn't know anything about pensions at 22. I barely know anything about it now, and I'm 38. But you know, I know more than I did back then. So having this sort of life experience, these sort of grown-up experiences, it's hugely beneficial, I think.
Okay. Thank you very much, Owen. We have quite a lot of questions coming in. What I would like to do, however, I realize that for people who don't work for the European Union, all these different institutions we're referring to can seem a little bit mysterious from the outside. And I think we all also remember that feeling as well when we first started our study. So if I could just ask you all very briefly to tell us a little bit about the institution that you work for, so that our audience has a bit of an idea, but keep it quite brief because we've got a lot of questions coming in. So Owen, you said you work for the Commission.
Yes, so the European Commission is basically like the civil service for the EU. It's divided into different departments, a little bit like ministries. They're called DGs, Director Generals, and they specialize in different areas, so trade, agriculture, customs, all of that. Our meetings tend to be quite technical when we work for the Commission itself. So as I was saying, things like, I don't know, customs duties or social security systems, that suits some people, doesn't suit everyone. Some people find that a bit dry. The European Commission also has the interpreting service, also works for three other institutions. In fact, the Council, which is where the member states have a say. So you get the staff working for what are called the permanent representations, a bit like embassies, and they come and they say, okay, this legislation is fine, yes, it's all good, but this won't work in my country because my member state is too small to implement it, etc., whatever. So you work for people coming from ministries or embassies rather than EU employees. And then we also work for the committees, the Economic and Social Committee and the Committee of the Regions, which are advisory bodies. And it's very different work as well. They tend to be much more spontaneous in how they speak, much less scripted maybe than Commission officials or Council meeting participants. So very varied, a lot of different things. One day you're in a very technical meeting about something very dry. One day you're in something which is much livelier. So it depends. Very varied at the Commission, I would say.
Okay, thank you very much. And Lorraine, what about the Parliament?
Hi. Yep, the Parliament as an institution is a co-legislator, so it works together with Council to adopt the budget and the legislation. And then the Parliament is made up of members, elected representatives from all 27 member states. And they are elected to represent their constituents and a certain political view. They are under no obligation to speak a foreign language. And so that means that in conducting their parliamentary business, they are entitled to speak any one of the 24 official languages. And that is where the interpreters play a key role. We are needed in a whole host of meetings at Parliament. You can have the political group meetings where they liaise on their position on various files, the more technical specialized parliamentary committees, the plenary where everything is fast and furious. But we also have smaller meetings, press conferences, workshops, hearings, seminars. Sometimes even you may find yourself in rather unexpected situations. Once I remember traveling with a farm delegation to mountainous regions in France and working away interpreting for the members of the delegation when I felt something tugging at my coat. And when I looked down, I realized it was one of the farm goats who'd developed a bit of a taste for my coat for the day. So I had to carefully keep interpreting as I tried to move away from that rather ravenous goat. So yes, expect the unexpected.
Okay, that sounds brilliant. And Phoebe, could you tell us a bit about the Court of Justice?
Well, at the Court of Justice, unfortunately, we don't have any goats to liven things up. As the name suggests, the Court of Justice is the judicial authority of the Union, and it ensures a uniform application of all the legislation proposed and then passed by the Commission and the Parliament, respectively. So we kind of come in at the end, if you like, when the legislation has been implemented and when problems arise in the implementation of that legislation. Perhaps there's conflicts with national legislation, which need to be brought into line with European law, or perhaps countries have questions as to how to interpret European law. And very important at the court is the principle of equal access to justice. And this means in practice, as interpreters, is especially important for us because it means cases can be brought in any of the official languages of the European Union. So a case could be brought in Bulgarian one day, and then for the entire procedure, if the case is brought in Bulgarian, let's say, the entire procedure takes place in Bulgarian. So we need interpreters who can work from Bulgarian into all of the other languages for the parties, the judges, everybody who is present in the hearing. And that makes it a really interesting multilingual environment to work in. Just like the Commission and the Parliament, we have a variety of topics that we cover as interpreters, because we have lots of different kinds of cases. We have European trademark cases, which can be really fascinating. Competition cases, which often involve large companies that you've all heard of, like Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, the usual names. We have infringement proceedings against the member states. So when they failed to implement legislation, the Commission usually starts actions against them. And as I said, lots of questions from the courts on how to interpret European law, which can really be fascinating, as there's some really interesting questions that come up out of that. So we cover a variety of subject matters. Some are drier than others, but that's life, isn't it? we all have things that we prefer over some subjects we prefer over others, but it really is a very interesting place to work from that point of view.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we have lots of questions about how to get to become an interpreter in more specific detail. We have a couple of questions about the interpreting course. You all referred to doing a master's in interpreting. We have a question about a master's in conference interpreting or a diploma, for example. Are they both accepted? What do you need to do in terms of formal qualifications to become an interpreter? Perhaps Owen or any volunteers? Owen?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this. So yes, you need to either have a bachelor's degree in interpreting and translation or a bachelor's degree in another subject and a postgraduate qualification in interpreting. And as the person pointed out, it can be a PG dip, so a postgraduate diploma, or a master's. I think the difference is just with a master's, you do some sort of thesis or research work at the end. But the most important thing to be eligible for the test is that you've done the interpreting modules and you've passed those modules. And actually, when I did the course, we were able to apply for the EU test without having submitted our dissertation. So as soon as we got our final results from the interpreting course, we got a sort of provisional transcript, which we could send off to the EU institutions, and that made us eligible for the test. So you don't have to wait then a full year to hand in your dissertation, etc. Yeah, I mean, it depends. Some people could maybe do it, go into interpreting straight after a bachelor's, but I really think it's better to do a bachelor's in something else. Maybe you can go straight into a master's like Phoebe did, but a lot of people take a little bit of time out and then go into a master's, later on. You don't have to wait 10 years like I did, but and look for a master's which has some sort of track record in training interpreters for the UN, the EU. Shop around a little bit, ask questions. As you know, have any of your graduates gone on to pass the accreditation test, if that's what you're interested in? It's a buyer's market. Look around, and you don't have to do, if you're an English mother tongue, you don't have to do your postgraduate course in the UK. You can go to a different country. So see what's out there.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, at the end of this webinar, we're going to put up a QR code, and that will send you a link to a lot of information about some of the universities that we work with on a regular basis. We often have virtual classes, for example, where working interpreters will sit in on classes with some of our partner universities. And you'll be able to find all of that information, as well as all the formal requirements for sitting the accreditation test, via the link that we'll put up on the screen at the end of the webinar. We have another question about, Owen's just touched on this, but about how to choose where to study your master's. Should you study in the language of, should you go to the language of your mother tongue? Should you go to another country? I think all of our panelists studied in the language of their mother tongue in the UK, but Lorraine, go ahead.
I was just going to add that I think that is a deeply personal choice, because it will depend on where you are in your life. We have many excellent colleagues who studied in France, in Spain, elsewhere, but trained obviously for the English booth. In my case, my choice was determined by the fact that I had spent several years living abroad, immersing myself in other languages. And I felt that in choosing interpreting, I really needed to nurture my mother tongue, and that it was important to spend a year back in a fully English-speaking environment.
Yeah, I think we're all nodding along with that. And I think many of us would agree, although you don't have to, of course. I don't know if anyone has anything to add to that. Otherwise, we can move on. Phoebe?
If I could just add, I mean, I looked into the possibility of studying, very briefly, I will add, of studying in Italy to do my master's, but I quickly became aware that since I really wanted to focus on interpreting into English and not interpreting, say, English into Italian, it depends what you want to do. If you're interested in working both ways, then maybe it is a good choice to go somewhere else to do your master, to do your qualification. But I ultimately decided to stick to the UK so that I could be in an English-speaking environment, because your mother tongue really is important, and we all recognise that as interpreters, it's very important. And I ultimately chose Bath. I will admit I was a bit lazy. I was at Bristol, so Bath was a quick jaunt down the road for me. And as I knew it had a very good track record, I immediately said, yes, okay, this is for me.
Thank you very much, Phoebe. And while we have you, Phoebe, and we're discussing UK universities, we have a question about nationality requirements. Are UK nationals eligible post-Brexit to be employed by the EU as interpreters? That's a question from Danielle, and that's one that comes up a lot. Now, Lorraine and Owen are both lucky enough to have Irish passports, so we'll put this question to Phoebe, I think.
Yes, thank you for the question, Danielle. It was only a matter of time before Brexit raised its head, as we were all anticipating, I'm sure. No, I only have British nationality, and it would not stop you working as an interpreter for the institutions. You are still eligible to sit the accreditation test. So I would encourage everybody who just has British nationality to still, don't let that dampen your dreams of becoming an interpreter if that's what you want, because you're still eligible. We have several colleagues from the States, from other places outside of Europe as well, who work alongside us every single day. So I would say, don't let it stop you.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. So having done our training, the next step in becoming an interpreter is the accreditation test. And we have a question about a little bit more detail, basically, about the accreditation test. So I don't know if someone would like to explain what happens in these accreditation tests. Perhaps Lorraine, I believe you've been on a panel or two.
I have, and obviously taken both my accreditation test and then later language adding tests. The main focus is to demonstrate your skills from your working languages in two interpreting modes, in consecutive and simultaneous. So when I took my accreditation test, at the time, and it may have changed since, I presented with French and German, and I was allowed to decide which language and which mode of interpreting I wished to begin with. So I chose German consecutive. I heard a speech, took notes, conveyed that speech afterwards in English. I went straight into a French simultaneous test, and then there was a break while the panel deliberated whether I could proceed to the next phase, which was German sim and French consec, or the other way around. In any case, you get tested in your languages in both consecutive and simultaneous. And for the English booth, you can be accredited with 2 languages, and it is a great start. Yes, you will be asked to learn more languages over the course of your career. And generally, if you enjoy languages, you will want to. But starting with 2 is entirely feasible, and you can have a really good career with that.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think one thing to bear in mind is that there's a lot of urban legends about these accreditation tests, and that you get failed for getting one word wrong, or, you know, they're fairly expensive and a bit of a hassle to organize, and we want people to pass. We're not there to keep people out. We're all on your side, and if we're inviting you for a test, it's because we want you to pass, and we need colleagues. Now, having passed an accreditation test, most people then become freelance interpreters. But there are also trainee schemes and things like that that are available to people. And we have a question from Darren about whether SCIC, which is the Commission Interpreting Service, whether they still offer a newcomer scheme or a traineeship for newly qualified interpreters in the English booth. So Owen, perhaps you would know the most about that.
Yeah, so SCIC, I should maybe just say what it is first. So it's the French acronym, which is Service Commun d'Interprétation de Conférence, so the joint interpreting service, conference interpreting service, because we cover several institutions. That's why it's called the joint service or the common service. Yes, so that's the Directorate General that I work for. We do still offer the newcomer scheme, especially for the English booth, because we need a lot of people at the moment. We haven't touched on the age pyramid. I'm sure you have the same age pyramid problems across the Parc Léopold over in Parliament and down in Luxembourg at the court. A lot of people who started as interpreters, say in the 1970s, 1980s, are now reaching retirement age. In the English booth this year at the European Commission, I think we have 2 or 3 colleagues going. And these are people who are going with a lot of experience, with a lot of languages. So we need a lot of people to replace them. And that's why we have something called the newcomer scheme. So it's basically kind of a soft launch onto the interpreting market. Instead of just coming to Brussels and, you know, getting the odd day here and there and trying to make ends meet in other ways, there's something called the newcomer scheme. They've played around a little bit with the format a few times. I was on the newcomer scheme when I did it. I got 100 days over 18 months. So it's enough to live on. It's not, you're not going to be, you know, a multimillionaire doing it, but it's definitely enough to live on. It's enough to justify moving to Brussels as well. So you get enough work. You also are assigned a mentor, and your mentor will, you know, give you advice. Colleagues will listen to you and will give you some feedback. They know you're a newcomer, because the problem isn't necessarily your languages, it's all the kind of jargon, all the background knowledge. So colleagues will really be very helpful and very nurturing. I found all the colleagues gave great feedback and were very constructive. So yes, the newcomer scheme does still exist. There was an intake this year. It varies from year to year. It depends on all sorts of factors that I won't go into. But as far as I know, it still exists at the moment, and it's likely to exist for the foreseeable future.
Okay, thank you very much. And Phoebe, you also mentioned a scheme in the court, and there's a question about that as well from Katie. So perhaps you could say a few words about the court scheme for newcomers.
Yes, absolutely. We do at the court. I think we're the only institution actually that offers a traineeship for interpreters, which is booth-based, and that's really important to emphasize, because if you do the traineeship, it's 2 months of pure practice. You sit in the booth in hearings. It really is a great experience. I did it back in 2014, and it was really intense, but absolutely beneficial for my interpreting skills, for my general knowledge as well. I should specify that at the court, we're the only service that you don't have to have a law degree to be an interpreter at the court. If you want to be a translator at the court, you need to have a law degree. And all the other services, I think, require a law degree, but interpretation, no. So we are not lawyers. And so sometimes it can be difficult to get to grips with some of the legal concepts and the jargon. So the traineeship was brilliant, not just specifically though to go on to work for the court. It's great interpreting experience in general. And I think to be eligible to do it, you have to have your interpreting degree. That's the first thing I would say. I tried to eagerly apply before I got my degree and was promptly told, nope, go away, come back when you have the piece of paper. So that's the first very important step. I do believe you have to have applied for an EU accreditation test to be eligible and passed the pre-selection tests. That was the last information I received. But you can find more information about the traineeship on the Curia website, which is the court's website. I think I put a link in my speaker bio to the Curia website, but if you just Google Curia interpreter traineeship, you'll find more information about it.
All right, thank you very much. And Lorraine, are there any schemes at the European Parliament?
Unfortunately, nothing devoted to interpreting specifically. There are traineeships that you can apply to take over a 6-month period working in the administration at the Parliament. And in the past, we've had interpreting graduates take those traineeship positions and make the most of the opportunity to practice in the booth, to make contact with interpreters. I believe there are even working groups in Brussels of interpreters gearing up to take an accreditation test, but nothing formal in Parliament per se. What I would say is that once you are accredited and start in the booth, you are generally assigned a mentor, and you will find that colleagues are helpful, as Owen said, and very supportive and constructive in their feedback. And I do think that's essential. One of the pieces of advice I was given during my master's degree that really rang true since was that you are still learning for the first 10 years at the very least. In fact, it's a very steep learning curve in those early years. And I would go as far as to say a good interpreter never stops learning.
Okay, and having said that, that brings us on to perhaps our final question, or almost, because I think we have to wrap it up quite soon, but there's a question about how you can keep learning. How do you keep your languages alive? How do you keep on top of current affairs? Is it newspapers? Is there a website? Oh, and what do you do to make sure that you're ready to go into the booth?
I'm a podcast junkie, I have to say. I'm very into podcasts. Yes, so podcasts in all sorts of languages. I walk to work every day. It's about a 30-minute walk, and on that walk in, I'll usually listen to 2 shortish podcasts in different languages. And often it's something that you've heard on a podcast on the way in that morning. It's just that cluster effect. Something that you listen to in the morning comes up in a meeting, or you you've vaguely heard of it and you think, oh yeah, that must be what that means. Yeah, podcasts. So all sorts of current affairs podcasts, things like there's a good one from The Guardian, different ones from The Economist, from Le Monde, from France Inter, all of those. So yes, lots and lots and lots of podcasts about everything.
Okay, that's great. And Phoebe, would you like to give any tips? And perhaps you can also pick up on Layla's question. Layla wants to know if her degree is largely literature focused, what can she do to learn more about law and economics and all of the other topics that she might need to know about?
Well, as Owen said, I think the podcasts are an excellent way to keep getting a constant stream of not only language, but the culture, and also a lot about economics, law, all of these things they're woven into all kinds of podcasts. So I really would recommend that as well. I'd support what he said. I also really like, I like reading, and reading is a great way with Amazon and Book Depository and all these websites where you can get translations of books that you love very easily. I mean, I think everybody tries to read Harry Potter in another language when they start as a linguist in any capacity. But I for one, I'm not highbrow with my literature. I'm a Stephen King junkie, so I buy books that I've already read by him in Portuguese. For example, I bought Misery so that I could reread it, and if you're familiar as well with the story, it helps you absorb even more. And as far as supplementing your studies with other topics, I would say do this as a sideline. Read as much as you can, pick up a newspaper. Even in the morning before I go to work, I have problems getting out of bed, so I lie in bed and I read news stories in different languages, just very quickly, headlines and things like that. It's very useful. As I said, I had no experience in law before I came here. You're always learning on the job, so to speak, whoever you're working for. I was very interested in film when I was a freelancer. I worked for a film website. I volunteered at film festivals, and yet here I am now working at the Court of Justice. So really, it doesn't matter as long as you're interested in learning, and you don't have to have encyclopedic knowledge of economics or law in your head. Just as long as you're aware of things going on around you, I would say.
Okay, and Lorraine, anything to add?
Just to very much echo what both Phoebe and Owen have said, keen interest and curiosity, podcasts are amazing. Read widely, and yes, it doesn't always have to be highbrow literature. For me, it's crime novels, and I try to find a good crime writer in any new language I'm learning to combine an enjoyable read with a bit of language learning. I do, when the opportunity presents itself, love to sit down with a proper newspaper and slowly flick my way through the pages. Netflix has some useful series in different languages. That's another good way to tune your ear into new languages. And yes, current affairs, very important. Read up on science, technology developments, but also remember that in meetings, people can refer to absolutely everything. So if the World Cup is going on, you probably want to know whose team has beaten the other, because it may be a source of banter in a meeting. And one of my experiences in a meeting that my nieces and nephews love to hear about was when a French speaker actually quoted a Marvel film and talked about how with great power comes great responsibility. So you really do get everything and anything in your meetings.
Okay, we lost you a bit at the end, Lorraine, but I think we got the message. And of course, all of you, don't forget your mother tongue. This will be drilled into you in interpreting school. We have a few questions and not much time, so maybe we'll pick up on one or two very, very briefly. And Owen, I'm going to put you on the spot because you said that you did a whole year of consecutive, and Simon wants to know, 3 tips, but maybe 1 or 2 is okay as well. 3 tips for consecutive interpreting. And for those of you who don't know, consecutive interpreting is the kind of traditional after dinner speech where a speaker will give a 5-10 minute speech and then the interpreter interprets the whole thing. And simultaneous is what we do most of the time in meetings, speaking and listening at the same time. So Owen, top consecutive tips.
First of all, I should probably say most colleagues don't like doing consecutive. Most colleagues would much rather be in a booth, protected, away from the delegates. So you're very exposed when you're doing consecutive. It tends to suit people who are into public speaking or acting, who like explaining things. I used to work as a language teacher, so I find it quite good. I find it a bit like explaining something to a class. So yes, tell the story. Be the speaker. You have to, take the role of the speaker. You're not yourself anymore. You're playing the speaker. That means you may be saying things that you don't agree with. And I'm sure the colleagues of Parliament know all about that because you have some quite extreme people in Parliament. So you have to take on their views. Tell the story, be aware of your audience, what your audience is going to need. So you may need to explain certain things. If they talk about, I don't know, it's a French speaker and they talk about the SNCF, your audience may not know that that's the national rail company. So you may need to add in some little things to, you're basically taking your audience by the hand and showing them around and giving them a view of this person's point of view. So yeah, really think of your audience. And I often think, if there's someone in my family or a friend or someone who I think would be interested in this, I just pretend that I'm talking to them. And that really helps me to use more natural language rather than just, parroting their jargon, maybe what the speaker is saying. Try to explain it in sort of layman's terms without dumbing down the message completely, but just it helps you to speak more naturally, I think, that way, if you have an audience member in mind. So there we go. And humor is horrible, by the way. I saw humor was mentioned. Interpreting jokes, interpreting wordplay is very, very difficult. Every now and again, you get a little, bit of genius, a little light bulb moment, but 9 times out of 10, it's untranslatable. And you do hear stories of people saying, the delegate made a joke, please laugh. Or you say, there was very clever wordplay in the original language. You can say something like that, but it's very, very difficult. But there are colleagues who are very humorous and who are stand-up comics and who are very good at all of that, but I'm not one of them.
And usually the perfect joke or wordplay will come to you about a week after you've actually done the interpretation. We have a few questions about kind of life in Brussels, moving to Brussels. Can you just work for a couple of days? Do you get accommodation in the package? No, you don't get accommodation. You have to find your own place to rent. Is it possible to work based from Milan? How competitive is it? What kind of salary can you expect? I mean, as a freelance, it's really up to you how much you want to work. If you choose to work 2 days a week, or we have colleagues who work for a few months and then go off and work as professional dancers for a few months, for example. We have colleagues doing all sorts of stuff, but I don't know if anyone wants to pick up on the practical side of moving to Brussels or Luxembourg, as it may be. Lorraine?
Yeah, I can talk about when I moved to Brussels, a frighteningly long time ago now. I was part of a group taking what would have been an earlier iteration, I think, of the newcomer scheme that Owen talked about. It was called the insertion scheme. There were about 30 of us across different booths starting at the same time. And what was lovely about that was we had almost a class of interpreting trainees gearing up for the accreditation test together. We helped each other out. We also supported each other. We started a Friday night drinks session just to be able to vent and recover from the stress of the week. Because remember, when you start interpreting, it is quite tiring putting in a full day in the booth, and you have to pace yourself. In Brussels is a great city to settle into. You will find everything you need. It's got all the cultural attractions that you find in big cities, but it isn't quite as crowded and hectic as, say, London, Paris, cities I've lived in and loved. But I definitely have come to prefer the slightly calmer pace of life in Brussels.
And Phoebe, perhaps you could pick up on that with reference to Luxembourg.
Yeah, I mean, when I initially became a freelance interpreter and translator, because I kept up my translation clients as well, I stayed in Italy for a bit, and then I moved to Brussels as well, and I was on the newcomer scheme as well whilst I was in Brussels. I didn't move to Luxembourg until I knew I was going to join the court as staff, so maybe it's a little bit different. I would say most of the work is based in Brussels, so if you're thinking of moving to one of the two, I would say Brussels. The court we are a smaller service, we have less work for freelancers. We still use a lot of freelancers, but I would say Brussels, also because Luxembourg is very expensive. But Luxembourg is also a great place to live. It's very green. It's if you like nature, it's a great place. We also have everything you need. It's very similar to Brussels in that respect. I would say if you like a calmer pace of life, Luxembourg is maybe a better option. But at the same time, I'm also from London, so I love big cities. I love my hometown, so I miss London occasionally, but Luxembourg is also a great place to live for someone who is used to the city.
Okay, thank you very much. And Owen, do you have anything you want to add quickly at the end of that, or do you think it's mainly been covered?
No, not a whole lot, but I've become a fan of Brussels over the years. I think when I first came, I was like, oh, I'm here for work and whatever, but I've really grown to like it. We actually have a visitor with us at the moment who's just gone out, and we were talking to her about the advantages of living in Brussels. You really have several different layers of culture, because you have the French-speaking culture, you have Dutch-speaking culture, you have a small German-speaking community, you have the expat culture. So if you want to go out and see a play in, I don't know, Estonian, there probably is a play going on somewhere in Estonian. You know, there are all these different communities living here, and it makes it a very diverse place, a very interesting place, a frustrating place at times, like anywhere. You know, the bureaucracy and whatever. Something which may sound like, you know, a backward compliment, but a backhanded compliment, is that it's also got great transport links. So if you want to go to Paris, if you want to go to London, you want to go to Cologne, Amsterdam, these places are all incredibly close to Brussels as well. So you can enjoy the quieter pace of life in Brussels and all that Brussels has to offer. But if you want to leave Brussels, it's got fantastic transport links. And it's not overly expensive, you know, for accommodation and stuff compared to London or Paris. It's very affordable. And a lot of people come and go because you have all these people working as trainees or on short-term contracts. There's always accommodation available. It's not like, you know, in other cities where there's a huge shortage of accommodation. So, yeah. And there are obviously lots of Facebook groups and different things. If you want to move to Brussels, there are different Facebook groups that you can join, or different websites that you can visit to find out about accommodation. It's quite easy to find a place to live here.
Okay, thank you very much. I think just to pick up on one question, somebody was asking whether it's possible to stay in Milan. To work for the institutions, we don't employ remote interpreters at the moment, so you would need to be in the place of the meeting. So you need to be in Brussels if the meeting's in Brussels, or in Strasbourg, or in Luxembourg. Of course, we do occasionally have missions. There may be work in Milan, but certainly not on a regular enough basis to sustain as your main source of income. And on salary, Louisa is asking, is it per day? Yes. If you're employed by the institutions, you're paid per day, and you are available to the institutions for all of that day. So I think we've got through most of the questions there. A final question to finish, I think, is which languages are underserved? There was a question about African languages. We do occasionally employ freelancers who have Russian or Arabic, Chinese occasionally. Occasionally we employ people with all different languages, but mainly if Russian or Arabic, for example, is your mother tongue, the European Union wouldn't be your main employer. You would be looking at the UN or the private market for that. And for the underserved languages, that changes all of the time. And I'm going to ask Ryan, I believe, is going to share a QR code with you, and that will take you to a website with all of the information that you need about the qualifications that you need, how to go about applying for an accreditation test, We organise accreditation tests a couple of times a year, depending on what booth you're in, what languages you have. So keep an eye on that website. And it also has information on which languages are required for each booth. And this changes occasionally. So at the moment for the English booth, you need to have 2 passive languages, and one of those must be French or German, and the other can be any European language. But that does change occasionally, and for other booths, the requirements are slightly different. So keep an eye on that website, and I believe there is information there on who you can contact if you have any additional questions. So I think we can bring it to a close for today. Thank you all for joining, and I hope that it has inspired some of you or encouraged some of you that working as an interpreter for the EU is not an unachievable goal, and it's never too late. And I'd just like to say thank you all very much, and hope to see some of you here in Brussels sometime. Thank you and goodbye.